Good afternoon and welcome to our second event in our Learn and Learn series. I am pleased to introduce you to Joyce Rigby Jones, who is the Joint Managing Director of Voltedge Management Limited, who are human resources specialists. Today, Joyce is going to talk to us about flexible working during and after COVID. So over to you, Joyce, and thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Sabine. And I'm just waiting to see if the slides come up and I can see them. You're very welcome, everyone, and thanks so much to Sabine and Danielle for welcoming me and asking me to speak to you here today. What I want to do is go through a number of slides and talk to you about remote working and COVID. Danielle, I'm not seeing the slides as yet, so just wondering if they're coming up.
Yeah, your slides are fine. But
yeah, I just don't see them at the moment.
Yeah, you need to click through.
Oh yeah, okay, that's great. So what I want to do today is really just talk to you. I know I have a mixed group here as well, so I'm very aware of that, that some of you have employees, some of you don't. And what we're looking at here today is a mixture, and really just want to talk to you about how you're dealing with remote working and how it's affecting people and what we do with it. So being honest, here we are. Yeah. So as I mentioned, we are HR consultants and we're dealing with issues with regard to remote working both before, during and after COVID. So it's something we're doing all the time. What I'd love to cover today with you, and please ask as many questions as you want at the end of the session. Flexible working, what does it really mean? Key tips for managing employees and contractors remotely. The remote working risks and opportunities, because there are risks as well as some opportunities, and just talk around that. And then obviously communications, which is so important during COVID times and beyond. So what types of flexible working are there? I think one of the things that we found during COVID is we've been talking constantly about blended and hybrid working, but actually there's lots of different types of flexible working. So I just want to remind some of you and talk to others that aren't aware of all the different types of opportunities of flexible working that we can and should consider. So remote teleworking is where you have an employee who is actually remote or constantly working remotely. Some companies are going to go to complete remote working going forward. Others are going to consider it. And again, I would suggest that we should all be considering our options and not diving into them immediately. The site office, the normal that we had previously, is now changed. However, do remember that with employees, their contracts of employment, virtually all of them to date, will clearly state that their place of work is your office or your site, whatever that might be. So up to now, everyone has received a contract of employment that states that their place of work is in a certain place, and that still remains. So employees who might come to an employer and say, I want to work remotely, please let me. You do have a choice, and it is a decision that you make on the basis of what's right for your business. So just remember that when you're thinking about what you're going to do going forward. Hybrid, well, that's the typical blended working model that everyone's talking about, where people have a choice and maybe they work partly in the office, partly at home. And again, that is a good option. A lot of people don't want to be driving in rush hour anymore. That seems to be something we've all agreed is not a good thing. But again, it should be in the business's interest and supporting the employee appropriately. So do think about what works best and what will work best in the long term, not just the short term. Part-time, well, actually, a lot of employees are having to work part-time because they're not only working remotely with their work, but they're homeschooling. They may have relatives they're taking care of, and even though they potentially have a full-time contract, they may be effectively working part-time and doing as much as they can in a difficult situation. So part-time work, I think, will be more and more of a request and an option that employers will be considering. Flexi-time, another where we have had this operating in the past where people have said, okay, maybe my core hours are say 12 to 2, and then I work around that to fill in the other hours as I need to. And that can work very nicely, particularly if you're in a business where you're dealing with different time zones. Maybe you're dealing with Asia or the US, and you need that flexibility with an employee to ensure that they can go on the calls at the right time. So I think flexi time is going to be much more of a conversation moving forward that an employer can really use to their benefit to ensure that an employee is working when they need them and not just in a fixed 9 to half 5 or whatever it might be. As and when contracts. Now, this is a terminology that's reasonably recent, and what it means is a contract of employment where an employee is offered work and they then take it if they want to take it. So, for example, maybe you have a business that's dealing with the public and you have projects that are happening every now and again. And you then go to an employee and say, listen, I'd like you to work for the next week on this project, and it'll be for 40 hours a week or 20, whatever. And the employee says, yes, that's great. I'm free and I can make myself free for that. That's super. That's the type of as and when contract, and that's what it means. And again, it's a very nice opportunity and a way of working with an employee that maybe has other commitments, maybe they're doing other things, and it gives both the employee and employer lots of flexibility. So again, a nice option and something that you can talk to us further about if you're considering it. Fixed term or fixed purpose. This is a standard contract of employment where maybe you say to an employee, listen, I need you for 12 months. I give you a fixed term contract. Very straightforward and very common. Fixed purpose is slightly different, and we see that used more with things like maternity leave. So, for example, if you have an employee going on maternity leave and you want to backfill that person, you offer them a fixed purpose, and there's no timeline on it, but they just cover that maternity leave. Fixed purpose can also be very useful, for example, if you are maybe in developing software and you have a particular piece of software work that needs to be done. You can clearly state what it is, but you actually don't know how long it's going to take. In that case, you could offer a fixed purpose contract to the individual, and once the work is done, their contract finishes. Job share, that's one that we haven't heard a lot of talk about over the last couple of years. It was quite common maybe a few years ago where you'd have maybe a person with kids at home and they want to work just for the morning and someone else offers to do the afternoon. It's still quite a good option and still something that employers should be open to if they found they had employees that had complementary hours that they wished to work. Compressed annualized hours, again, this is an area I think we're going to see a lot more interest in going forward, because with remote working and the way COVID has affected us, we're actually seeing employees doing the work and the hours aren't such a big deal. So for example, if you think of an employee who needs to get a certain amount of work done, normally we would have said, well, they're going to work 40 hours a week and they'll get it done in maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Now we're sort of saying, well, actually, we don't really mind how many hours they work as long as they get the work done in a clear space of time, and we don't have to put a time limit on it as long as they know there's a deadline to meet. So annualized hours, compressed hours are going to be another conversation I think we're going to hear a lot more about in the future. And then term time working, that's really an example of where maybe a mother wants to work during a term and they're not going to work during the holidays. Again, not very common. It only works probably in companies that have equally term time focus, and their business works around that, which is unusual. So those are the different types of working, lots of different areas that maybe employers haven't been thinking about. We've been so focused on this hybrid blended model. Don't forget about the other options and what you can discuss with your employees. So let's just move forward to facilitating flexible working. Well, what do we need to do and how do we do it? Firstly, we need to have a healthy organisational culture and support from our top team. There's no point thinking about flexible working and managing employees remotely if our senior management team and our CEO isn't committed, and that we have a healthy organisational culture. And remote working does involve an element of trust. We need to trust each other on this. So if you don't have that trust embedded in your culture, it's going to be very hard to manage. We need to go and look at our flexible working strategies and policies. If we don't have any, fine, we'll put some in place. If we do, we need to review them and make sure it's reflecting what we want in the company going forward. And don't forget about health and well-being. We know that COVID, and I'll talk more about this later, has put a lot of strain on people. We need to have that in our consideration in flexible working policies. Do think about planning or piloting or trialing. Maybe you have everyone remote at the moment and you're thinking, well, how am I going to bring people back into the workplace, or how am I going to manage my small team? Do think about trialing or piloting. You don't have to jump in and agree to complete remote working going forward or a blended work environment. You could trial it and see if it works. And then don't discriminate. Make sure you're being fair. So, for example, if I'm being given 2 days a week on site and 3 days a week at home, and my colleague is being given the opposite, and they're getting 3 days a week in the office and 3 days or 2 days at home, it may seem that we're discriminating. So you need to be very careful that you're treating people fairly. And, you know, a receptionist working in a company, they have to work in the office 5 days a week. They are probably going to look at those remote working people and say, gee, I wish I could work remotely some of the time because I think they have an easier time. So implementing flexible working needs to be done carefully and with conversation and with communication to ensure people don't feel there's any discrimination. IT support goes without saying. Practical issues, home office working time, understanding how people are working at home, their work environment. Some people are going to be dying to get back into an office because their home working environment is totally unsuitable. So you need to take that into consideration and look at individuals, not just the business requirements. The other issue about flexible working, we know that it's going to be harder for people who are certainly fully remote working to be visible in terms of their career and being maybe promoted. So think about that as well. Certainly we need to be aware that maybe ambitious people who are remote working aren't going to be seen as much. And because of that, we as employers and managers need to be very conscious of that and work with them to ensure there's no loss of potential for employees with a flexible working environment. What are the barriers? Well, yes, there's barriers as well. The organisational or the industry you're in is not conducive to flexible working. Some of us are working in manufacturing or environments that just don't lend to flexible working at all. And in that situation, we've just got to make sure we're coping and that our employees aren't stressed because of that. And we are seeing that a silent majority of people who are in essential services, for example, working in manufacturing or retail, who haven't had a break at all over the last year, haven't had real emphasis put on them, and we need to realise that and appreciate that. Senior management may not be on board. Maybe a manager is saying, well, I don't trust Joyce to work on her own. You know, something I need to keep an eye on her, so I want to bring her in more. And when we get out of level 5, I prefer to have her in the office. If that's the case, you need to look at your trust and the situation and the relationships between manager and employee, because it probably won't work if you continue at that basis. You need to look at your culture. Particular jobs levels are not suitable. We've talked about that really. Some employees aren't going to be able to work in a flexible environment. Operational pressures, some companies will have particular stress times when a business is really ramped up, and perhaps that's a time when they will need to have more people in an office environment. Rostering, scheduling may be difficult, being fair about that. And policies don't enable flexible working. If the policies don't enable flexible working, they need to be reviewed, otherwise it's not going to work. And lack of fairness, maybe a company feels they can't be flexible because it's not going to allow for fairness. So do think about these barriers. You need to eliminate them to ensure you have flexible working processes in place that suits people and they accept it and they know it's fair. Okay, George Bernard Shaw, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. This is so true, because often enough we get clients saying to us, but you know, Joyce, we told our employees we're going to do this, and yet they don't seem to be getting it. Just be sure you're telling employees, and employees understand what's happening. COVID has brought real difficulties to us in communicating and ensuring we're getting the right message across. Don't think that you need to just say it once, say it twice, say it 3 times. Communicate, communicate. Make sure that you're over communicating at this point in time, not under. Okay. The impact of the tools we use. This is a very interesting graph, and hopefully you can see it reasonably clearly there. The bottom line says richness of communication channel, and up the other side is the communication effectiveness. And what COVID has done to us, it has brought down our communication effectiveness significantly, because we don't have the opportunity at the moment to do face-to-face communication with any of our employees unless we're essential workers or we're in a manufacturing or retail. So we've immediately dropped halfway down to in the effectiveness of our communication channels. So that means we probably need to be over communicating as much as possible in the channels that we're using. And that means when we're doing our Zoom and our team calls, when we're picking up the phone, we need to be constantly talking about the key communications that we need to be making to our employees and really driving that communication channel up further as much as we can. And here's another slide that emphasizes this. You know, when we're geographically distant, we have to persist in the way that we communicate and really drive communication strongly. So phone conversations, maybe use picking up the mobile phone as a casual, informal way of communicating, and keep the Zoom and the Teams for that formal business communication. And try and separate out the different ways of communication. Maybe that, you know, the WhatsApp groups are more informal, and we keep that for the nice conversations, and actually identify different ways of media for different types of communication. So do think about that. COVID-19, I'm not going to tell you about what's happened to us, but briefly, what has happened. And I think this week, with the new path ahead that the government issued yesterday, which is 60 pages long, guys, if you haven't read it already, COVID-19 Resilience and Recovery 2021, that's going to cause more demotivation and fatigue, because we know now that we're stuck in this level 5 till at least April. A feeling of being fed uncertain knowledge and unable to control what's happening is constant. And the health implications, my goodness, we have a lot of them. We know that up to 45% of adults feel adverse health effects on their mental health. And we do know that counsellors are saying that their rate of communication with people has risen up to 100%, which is huge. So there is a real issue here. What can we do? Well, we need to personally manage our own mental health, as well as people who maybe report into us. Manage our own workload and be a good role model. Spot the warning signs, know your triggers, have those well-being conversations with your team if you have one, or with good friends or colleagues if you don't. Tackle your poor habits and keep in touch with people. Seek the help and support when you can. That's really important. So Managing remotely, just to go over what we need to do here. Whoops, I skipped a slide there. New employees are particularly vulnerable, and we have other employees who are vulnerable already. So focusing on them and really communicating daily with them is critical. We need to have clear plans for new employees, particularly young employees. Career progression is going to be harder. We need to think seriously about that. Performance management, we need to be very clear about the KPIs and the objectives we're setting so that we can manage them remotely as well as we would have done if the person was in the office. We need to think about innovation. How are we going to tap into those ideas and think about how we're going to really talk to employees about those informal conversations that we're not having as much of. And maybe if we have reduced costs because of COVID, maybe power that into things like wellness supports. So building a good remote culture, mix your communication mediums, maybe use the phone and video differently and agree those non-negotiables. Look at your team practices around trust, ownership and accountability. Make an extra effort to create and provide shared context. Use smaller teams maybe to connect. So have a buddy system or maybe pair up people to have informal phone conversations with no agenda, just to get that communication going. Allow some time maybe at the start of each meeting, if you're having Zoom and team meetings, have a 10-minute window where you can have just a chat at the beginning or at the end so that it's not back to back and you're not getting a break at all. And new employees, they really do need that daily contact. Have a buddy assigned, have a real plan, an induction process that makes them feel they're part of the culture and community. What next? Well, there is a right to request remote working directive being considered at this moment in time, and this will be rolled out, we think, in 2021. It will have implications for your business. We're not quite sure what the determinants will be as yet. Hybrid blended working, plan and prepare, align with your working patterns, and then think about the processes and the procedures you need to have in place. There's a potential opportunity to tap into broader pools of talent for your business. So if you're thinking of more remote working, you have the opportunity to perhaps employ or contract with people outside of your normal Dublin or Cork or Ireland. You may be actually able to tap into a much broader pool. Redefining the purpose of the office and the culture. Think about that going forward, because we need to make sure that we have a really strong culture that grows with our changes. Communication and collaboration tools we've talked about, understanding your own and other people's fears. We still have to overcome those things like getting back into public transport, hygiene, shared facilities. That's all going to come back at us after we go through into phase 4 or level 4 or level 3, and we need to start thinking about that again. Health and safety, what are your obligations and risks as an employer for home workers? And a phased approach. Do take a step at a time. There's a huge amount to do here. Fear of being left out. Some people think remote working is wonderful. Others want to get back into the office. We all have different fears around this. And we hope that the lessons we've learned with COVID will lead to a better normal, not a different normal. So key takeaways. Consider all the options for flexible working. Don't just see it as a blended 2-day, 3-day a week. There's lots of options there. Analyze, assess, and minimize the virtual distance with your colleagues as best as you possibly can. Take time to build your toolkit of possible and positive communication language. Value the role feedback can play in personal improvement and development. Think about wellness. Think about how your team is. Look at your culture and strategy going forward, because it's really important now. And communicate, communicate, and communicate. Okay, and that's really it, guys. I hope that was a very brief whistle-stop tour of remote working and what's going to happen going forward and what you need to be thinking about. I'd love to hear questions and hopefully answer some of your questions or even your insights If we can do that, that would be great, Danielle. Can you hear me?
Yep, Sabine has questions for you.
Great. Super, Sabine. Yep.
There might be an issue maybe with Sabine's. If I start with the first question, Joyce, and then maybe
That's
Sabine
great.
can. Yeah. So the first one says, you mentioned policies. Is there a particular legislation we should be aware of or refer to?
Yeah, there are policies that are in place. I mean, the key ones that are becoming a big issue for employers is the Working Time Act, which states that you have to be responsible for the hours of work that your employees do. And it's very clear that companies should be logging and tracking hours of work. Now, that's become really difficult with remote working. And we do think that there will be a change in the legislation going forward to try and make this easier for employers. But in theory, you should be tracking employees' hours if they're remote working and making sure that they're getting their 30-minute break every 4 hours and a 60-minute break every 6 hours. So that's one critical thing. There's no law in terms of flexible working. There's no directives. An employee does have a right to request part-time work, and an employer should respond, and if they want to push it out for six months, they can do that. But the employer should give a reason if they can't facilitate it. And we think that there could be changes in the law in this space as well. And the right to remote working, as I said, that's a directive that's being considered, and we should see more legislation or employment legislation on this, I think maybe mid-2021. Leo Varadkar is very active in this space, so we know there's going to be a lot more employment law legislation coming down the line. Okay, perfect. Sabine, are you back in line now? Do you want me to continue with questions?
If you can hear me, yes?
Yes, okay.
I can, yeah.
I'll hand over to Sabine then.
Thanks, Danielle. Are there supports for working from home that we can suggest to our employees is the next question, Joyce.
Yes, the HSA has a very good website, and it even has a checklist that you can send to employees who are working at home, and it talks about the essentials that they need to be aware of. So I would refer you to the HSA. There are lots of good tips also on the gov.ie. I mean, they have an excellent COVID website, and there are some very nice videos that you can also link into that talk about home working. But the HSA would be the first point of contact I would suggest you go to and have a look at their content.
That's great. Thank you, Joyce. The next question is, what is the responsibility for employers to make sure their employees are working safely?
Yeah, and this is a moot point. We have a lot of conversation at the moment around the employer's direct responsibility and the insurance implications of employees working at home. And this is a fluid area, to be quite honest, at the moment. But certainly from an employment law perspective, an employer has a duty of care to their employee, and that doesn't matter where they're working. So if you're an employer, you have a duty of care to ensure that your employee is working in a safe and secure environment. So I do suggest that you ask employees, send them the checklist if you see it on the HSA website. Tell them to send you a photo of their workplace, their work desk, their chair, and have a look at that and make sure that there aren't, real danger points, wires everywhere, or maybe they're sitting on a bench, maybe they're sitting on their bed. I mean, if they are in a really bad workplace environment remotely, it's something you need to at least discuss with them and see if you can amend that. You need to be seen to be working as an employer to ensure that they're in a safe environment, and that is critical. Take notes about it, have conversations, and hopefully move them to a situation where you can actually say, yes, I know they're now working safely, or actually when we get to level 4 or 3, I'm going to bring them in because there isn't a way for them to work remotely. And that's why you're hearing a lot of employers thinking about utilising employment hubs or shared office locations, maybe near an employee. Perhaps that employee was commuting quite long distances. So those are the things that employers are thinking about at the moment.
Thank you, Joyce. The next question touches a little bit on the same area and it is asking, should I be providing a risk assessment? Is it mandatory? So,
well, you should be providing a risk assessment, yes. It's not absolutely mandatory, but again, you as an employer have a duty of care to your employee. I would suggest that you should be asking every employee to fill out a form saying, what are you doing? How are you working? Send a photo of your workspace to me. I want to confirm your situation and how you're working. I would suggest that if you had what we're hearing is the HSA have inspectors that can go out and investigate workplaces. Now, they've been investigating offices, obviously, or sites of work. But I think we possibly may have a situation in the future where if a company has gone to remote working, that the HSA will have to consider investigating individuals and their situation. So I think we should preempt this, and we should as employers be checking this out. So yes, go for the checklist, check it out, ask for photos, take a log of it, and then you will at least have done a considerable amount to make sure that you're acting in a responsible manner.
Thank you, Joyce. And the next question is general nature as well. What is the requirement as regards HR for working from home?
The requirements for HR. Again, there's a few critical things that I've mentioned. The logging of hours. Some of our employees have gone from working from 9 to 5:30 in an office to working from maybe 6 to 9 in the morning and then 5 to 10 at night because they're doing homeschooling. And that is actually fine. But as an employer, you do need to make sure that that employee is taking a break, that they're not stressed out, that they're coping. So COVID has brought an additional responsibility on us as an employer and a manager. We can actually ask questions that we would never have asked to our employees before. So if I have a small team of employees and they're all working remotely, there's no reason why I can't get on the phone and say to one of my direct reports, how are you doing? Are you coping okay? How are you managing? I know you have kids at home. Are you managing okay? How are you doing your hours work? Are you getting breaks? Are you feeling okay? How's the workload? These are the questions we should be talking to our individual employees about. We would never have done this before, but COVID has driven a different type of responsibility, and we're asking questions that potentially we would never have asked to our employees, but we're doing it for the right reason, because we want to know that they're safe, that they're as well as they can be, and we need to be aware of their mental health and wellness. And we as managers need to be looking for the cues. So if you're doing a formal team meeting, most of you will be connecting in every day or at least every week with your team. Make sure that there is a time when they have their cameras on, that they are interacting with you, that you can see them, and that you know that they look okay. And then maybe have that individual one-to-one call with them to say, how are you doing, Sabine? Are you okay? You know, I realize you have a lot on your plate at home at the moment. I'm feeling the same actually, and you know, when we got the news that we're heading for April again in this lockdown, I was feeling really quite demotivated, but let's try and work around this. So empathize and talk to your employees about this. We are going through a global crisis. We've never been through this before, and I think as employers we've got to be much more empathetic than we ever were before.
Thank you very much, Joyce. There is no more questions, so I would just like to thank you for this very interesting.
One more just came in there. If
okay,
you
Danielle.
Yes, sorry.
Yep. Super. Sabine, can you see it? Oh, Danielle, yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Sabine. It just came in about the right to disconnect in Ireland.
Yes.
I think I've heard that term before, and they're looking for, is there somewhere to get more information on that, please?
Yeah, the right to disconnect is being considered at the moment, and the government are looking at a proposal and have already received consultation and feedback from different organisations such as IBEC and unions, etc., etc. And HR, we have the CIPD is the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. We've given input into this as well. So that is being considered at the moment by Leo Varadkar's department. We expect that there will be some announcement or further communications on that over the next few months. And we'll see then what the decision is. I don't expect any new act or any directive to be immediately input, but it's certainly something that the Irish government will bring into play in some form in the future.
Thank you very much, Joyce. So that's the last of the questions.
Great.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive and very interesting and topical presentation. Thank you very much, Joyce.
Thanks a lot, Sabine. And just to say that you know, if anyone did want to, they think of a question they haven't had time, they can send it to info@voltedge.ie. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And we look forward to hopefully doing another session with you in the future. Thanks again to Sabine, Danielle, and to Paul, and for my team in Voltedge. Thanks very much, and enjoy your lunches, everyone.